move upward, the ones behind them are going to be following. And so where you get that water from in the first place, remember the root's primary job is to absorb water and nutrients. So it's absorbing water from the ground, and then that's supplying the water necessary to move upwards due to this transpiration process. So the process involved in xylem transport are going to be three main things. The first thing that's going to happen is this transpiration is going to occur. So you're going to get this water evaporating from the top of the leaves. The next thing that's going to happen is that water, it's going to move upward through the xylem. Again, it's moving upward because all the water molecules are connected to one another. And then finally, the last thing, in order to replace the water that just moved up, your roots are absorbing a lot of the excess water. And so that's what pulls the water into the roots. And then once they're in the roots, they're connected to all of the rest of the water molecules. So it's just a constant cycle of transpiration and these water molecules being pulled out of the ground and upward throughout the tree. Make sense? Okay. Okay, so we already mentioned the stomata. The stomata is going to be found on the leaves. And these stomata, these are also like little holes, and this is where, sorry, okay then. So these stomata are going to be little holes that are on the bottom of the leaf. And so we have our leaf right here, and so you have all these stomata, and this is where the carbon dioxide is going to go in, and then oxygen is going to leave. Well, these stomata, these are also helping to conserve the amount of water that's contained within a plant. Now, some other function, or some other, I should say, structure, the cuticle is also going to help prevent water loss. So the way that the cuticle works, it's this thick, waxy layer on the outside of a leaf. And I know y'all have seen those shiny looking plants that feel real thick and waxy. That's what the cuticle is. So the cuticle is kind of like a waterproofing mechanism that's going to help keep that water from evaporating as much. Now you're still going to have some evaporation, but that cuticle can help maintain a lot of the water within a plant. Yeah, Alexandra?
Does the cuticle, does it cover the entire leaf or just like the top part of
It usually covers the entire leaf. And a lot of times it'll cover the stem too. So it's helping prevent loss of water from everywhere on the plant. And so the stomata, again, this is normally where the gas exchange occurs, but the stomata are also going to help prevent water loss based on the amount of potassium ions that are present. So remember when we were talking about photosynthesis, we were talking about alternative methods of carbon fixation. So we said the default were these C3 plants, but then we also had the C4 plants and the CAM plants, and those guys close their stomata during the day. Well, the thing that regulates whether stomata is open or closed is going to be dependent on the state of the cells, whether they're going to be flaccid or whether they're going to be turgid. And so if you look at the stomata, again, the stomata, you can see, is on the underside of the leaf, and you have two types of cells. They're called guard cells. So think of them as guarding the entrance into the stomata, into the leaf. And so these two guard cells, so there's one and there's the other, they kind of come together to form this little oval-shaped stomata. These guard cells, depending on their state, are what help regulate whether stomata is open or closed. If the stomata is open, that's because these plant cells are turgid. Remember we said plant cells prefer to be in a hypotonic solution, and they prefer to be turgid. So when the plant is happy, the stomata is open. And the reason why is because you have all of this water inside of the guard cells. Now potassium, it wants to, based on the rules of diffusion, if there's more potassium outside, it's going to want to move inside, right? And so that movement of potassium ions is going to further increase the movement of water, because remember, water follows the solute. So wherever potassium goes, that's where water's going to go. So in a turgid stomata, you have potassium entering and then the water entering to help make it into that turgid state. Whereas if you don't have a whole lot of water, potassium is going to want to leave these guard cells, and so water is going to turn around and follow it, so you're going to lose a lot of that volume of water in your guard cells. And so that's going to make these flaccid. And so it's depending on whether or not you have the turgid guard cells or the flaccid guard cells that are going to determine whether your stomata are open or not. If you have the turgid cells, which are going to be really happy and full of water, then there are going to be lots of potassium ions in, and that's going to be followed by lots of water molecules in. And so when you have these turgid cells, that's going to be an open stomata. And when you have these flaccid cells, potassium is going to leave these guard cells, and water is going to follow it. And so that's going to result in this flaccid guard cells. So they're open when they're turgid, and they're closed when they're flaccid. And this all has to do with potassium and the availability of water. Questions? Okay. Now we're going to start talking about phloem. So phloem is used to transport the products of photosynthesis, sugar, throughout the rest of the plant. And like we said, the only part of the plant that's making sugars are the leaves. The roots aren't, the stems aren't. And so we have to transport those sugars from the leaves to the rest of the plant. And so there is this structural element to the phloem. You have what's called a sieve tube element. And you have multiple of these sieve tubes attached to one another. So we have one here, one here, one here, and that's attached to another one, so forth and so on. And in between those sieve tubes, you have what's called a sieve plate. And it looks like just kind of like a little filter right here. And so the sugar has to be transported through the sieve plate as it's traveling down the sieve tubes. And the sieve tubes, all they are is just literally like the opening or the container, the vessel that is transporting the sugar molecules. And then you also, next to each sieve tube, so this is not a living thing, this is just, cellulose and polysaccharides and stuff like that. Well, this sieve tube is going to be right up next to a companion cell. And so that companion cell is going to help assist the transport of these sugar molecules through the sieve tubes and through the sieve plates. So the structures that make up the phloem are going to be the companion cell, the sieve tube, and then the sieve tube element. Again, yeah, go ahead.
So you said the companion cell pretty much just helps it?
Yeah, the companion cell is there to make sure it has all the nutrients and everything it needs, and basically is there to assist in the process. Other than that, you don't need to worry about the details.
It would go through the sieve plate first.
Yeah, well, so, it's going to go through both. At the bottom, I think you just have, so at the end of this chain of phloem, I think you would have, a sieve plate at the very bottom, and then it would go tube, plate, all the way up. All right, and so in addition to sugar, which is, being made in photosynthesis, the phloem can also transport other minerals and organic products, including amino acids, used to build proteins, hormones, which are proteins that are secreted from cells, also enzymes, also mRNA. So it's not just sugar that's traveling, but for the most part, the phloem is responsible for sugar transport, but it is capable of transporting these other substances through the phloem as well. Questions?
Where can you find the phloem sap? Or
The phloem sap is the stuff inside the phloem. And so phloem, or the sap, is what's made up of the water and the minerals and these sugars. And so that's why sap is kind of like thick. It's all that kind of sugar, and it's real sweet. That is the sap, is all that sugar and all those, molecules along with some water. Other questions? All right. So, just like we had the cohesion tension theory, which described how xylem transport works, we have another theory that describes how phloem works. And this theory is called the pressure flow theory. And so this theory is used to describe how the sugar molecules get from the leaves throughout the rest of the plant. And so those leaves, the photosynthetic parts of the plants, those are going to be called sources. They're called sources because they're the source of sugar. All right, it's just another way of saying that they're the guys who are photosynthesizing. Now, all the rest of the parts that don't photosynthesize, those are called the sink. Don't ask me why they're called the sink. They're just called the sink. It just means that they're the non-photosynthesizing parts of the plant, like the roots and the stems. And so the point of the phloem transport is to take sugar from the source and send it to the sink throughout the rest of the plant. And so this is going to be regulated by osmosis and diffusion. And so what's going to happen, these sugars are all going to be made in the source or in the leaves. And then based on diffusion, they're going to enter into the phloem. And then because you have all this sugar entering into the phloem, what do you think is going to happen? Water is going to follow the sugar into the phloem. And so when you have water flowing into the phloem, that's going to make them turgid, right? It's going to put more pressure on it. And so it's that pressure due to that excess water that's going to force the water and the sugar throughout the rest of the plant. So again here, just to review briefly, we have the source, which is always only going to be the leaves. Everything else on the plant is the sink, including, fruits, flowers, and whatnot. But during this phloem transport, again, we have all of the sources up here. So we have our mesophyll cells. These are the guys that are photosynthesizing, making the sugars. And then as they make those sugars, they will diffuse into the phloem. Well, as the sugar moves in, you better believe water's going to follow right behind it because water chases the solute. So wherever the sugar goes, the water's going to follow. And so by this diffusion of sugar and then the osmosis of water, that buildup is going to increase the pressure on the plant. And so that pressure is what's going to help push the solute or push the sugar molecules down throughout the rest of the plant. And then once the sugar molecules travel all the way through the phloem and they get to where they need to go, whether it's the stem or the root or whatnot, the sugars, they'll just diffuse out of the phloem, and because the sugar left, now the water's going to leave, right? So it's all about osmosis and diffusion. So these phloem cells are going to fill up with sugar at the leaves, at the source. They're going to fill up with sugar, and then water is going to help fill it up, and then that's going to put pressure on the plant, and it's that pressure that's forcing the sugars down throughout the rest of the plant. And then once those sugars reach where they're going, reach one of the sinks, they'll hop out of the phloem, and because the sugar left, the water will then leave. And then the process starts over from the top. So phloem transport is only unidirectional. It's only going down. There's no reason to go up. First of all, there's no sugar down here other than what we just transported to it. So there's no reason for phloem to travel upward because all the sources are up towards the top of the plant and all the sinks are towards the bottom of the plant. Yeah.
And is that separated to like where the sugar and the water are leaving? Is that like the bedrock or before the bedrock?
No, this is going to be, so remember all this is still, so the roots, this is occurring in the roots down here. And actually, the xylem goes all the way from the roots all the way to the top. I'm saying the phloem, well, the phloem and the xylem go all the way from top to bottom. So if you think of it at the very, very bottom, you have the roots. And so the roots are primarily going to be in the topsoil. That bedrock is going to be way, way, way down below. So we're mostly dealing with the topsoil, and we're talking about the roots of these types of plants. But you did bring up another point that I forgot to mention. So as this pressure is pushing these sugar and water molecules down, once they get to the sinks, those sugars are going to diffuse out of the phloem, and the water is then going to diffuse back into the xylem. And so from the xylem, it will turn around and go back up to help the process out again. So you still have, sugars diffusing out and water moving out. It's just the water is not necessarily coming in the same direction as these sugar molecules, because now these sugar molecules are going to be used by all these other cells. They're going to go into glycolysis and cellular respiration and make energy and then go on doing their normal plant thing. So as the sugars leave the xylem, they'll go to the other cells that need it. And then as the water leaves, it's going to turn around and osmosize, I just made up a word, into the xylem so that it can travel back up and this process can repeat. And so this process is called the pressure, pressure flow, theory of flow and transport. So make sure you know and can explain what's going on in both of these situations. Again, these are perfect short answer questions. All right, questions about, yes?
Could you just explain what osmosis is really quickly?
Yeah, so osmosis, remember, is the movement of water molecules. And remember we talked about hypotonic, hypertonic, isotonic, all that stuff. Well, osmosis is just defined as the movement of water from an area of low solute to an area of high solute. So another way of saying that, the water is always going to follow the solute. So just like this example, here's our xylem, here's our phloem. And so as sugar enters the phloem, water from the xylem is going to come and try to dilute that. And so it's this addition of sugar and water that's pushing the sugar molecules down. And so osmosis is just the movement of water from a area of low solute to an area of high solute. And if you want to look at the example of a cell, let's just say we've got a ton of calcium ions in a cell. And you've only got a few of them outside the cell. So the water is going to travel from areas of low solute concentration outside the cell to areas of high concentration. So the water is going to move across the cell membrane and it's following wherever the high concentration of solute is. Better?
Yeah.
Okay. Other questions?
In a nutshell,
Yes.
the diffusion of the sugar molecules and the osmosis of H2O travels down the stem to the stem and roots, and then the sugars will diffuse out. Once it's done, sugars will diffuse out of the phloem, and once the sugar leaves, the water will leave as well.
Yeah, and the water will leave and it will go back into the xylem where it came from.
The xylem.
So the water starts in the xylem, up here, and then once the sugar molecules enter, then you have the water, come in through osmosis, they'll go down, and then once the sugars leave, then the water will turn around and go back up to the xylem.
And we need to know that last part, like what happens
Yes,
to the
you
water
need to
and
know
sugar.
what happens in cohesion tension and also in pressure flow theories. All right, any other questions? Okay. Couple more slides and we're done.
Sorry.
All right, so the last couple things we're going to talk about are parasites. And so there are some organisms that actually serve as parasites on plants. One of them is mistletoe. Y'all know what mistletoe is. You hang it up at Christmas time, hoping to get a kiss out of somebody. Well, this mistletoe is actually a parasite. It's not part of the plant. And so what a parasite does by definition is it'll latch on to some living organism and it'll suck all the nutrients and all the products of photosynthesis and suck all the good stuff away from this plant. So in this case, you can see all these bushels of mistletoe that aren't actually originally part of the tree. And so as the water and the sugars being transported, they'll kind of steal a lot of those and literally act as a parasite. But you don't want the parasite to be so damaging that it kills the host, right? Because if you kill the host, then you can't get any more sugar, energy, water, nutrients from it, etc. So the best parasites are going to be the ones that can attach to an organism and, suck out a little bit of stuff, but not so much that's going to kill the overall host. Y'all have heard of orchids before, right? Nice, pretty, exotic flowers. Those are actually parasites. They actually grow on trees. They're not supposed to be there. They're just really, really pretty to look at. They just happen to be very beautiful. But they're still parasites. What?
They're super expensive.
Yeah, they are super extensive because they're up, especially in the rainforest. You find a lot of them in there. And so when I was in Costa Rica in May, you see lots of them, but they're like 30 feet up. But you see these pretty little orchids just coming out of these huge, massive trees. So in addition, they're rare, they're expensive, and they're hard to obtain. But they're actually, it's just a parasite, which is, you know, kind of ironic. All right. Okay, so we're done. And we only have 3 review questions. All right, Michelle.
They summarize the cohesion tension theory.
Yep.
The cohesive properties of water is the continuous flow of water from the soil to the evaporation.
Right, so you're going to start with this transpiration, this evaporation of water from the leaves. So as the water is evaporated, because all of the water molecules are connected, it pulls, as the water is evaporated, it pulls the rest of the water molecules upward towards the top of the plant. All right, number
That's all it is?
That's all it is. That's all it is. It's just got a big fancy name. Like I said, think of the water molecules, I can't talk today. Water molecules in a Congo line, right? So if one goes somewhere, the others are going to be following.
So what is transpiration?
Transpiration is the evaporation of water from leaves.
Oh, okay.
Transpiration is the evaporation of water from leaves. Daniel, you want to describe pressure flow?
Pressure flow is the flow of the sugar molecules
Mm-hmm.
through the phloem.
Mm-hmm.
Once the sugar molecules